today we're kind of coming in for a landing, because when you look at the Gospel of Mark, this is kind of the key. This is the point to which Mark was building. And if you compare that in the other Gospels, I wouldn't say that about any of the other Gospels, because in the other Gospels I'd say the resurrection is what becomes sort of the key to understand the gospel. Everything is built to the resurrection and what happens after. That I don't think that's the case in Mark. I think the resurrection you can almost compare or hold as postlude, like the time before Jesus begins his ministry, which includes his baptism, becomes sort of a prelude. The resurrection in Mark is pretty simple. We'll talk about that next week. But the crucifixion, the cross, in this gospel is really, really pivotal. And we know that based on what Mark told us in chapter 1, verse 1. Because he told us that he's writing about Jesus, who is Son of God and and Christ. Christ, Son of God. And he's talked about Jesus as the Christ. And if you had to characterize all those, what would be words you'd use? If you think about Jesus, Jesus as Christ has authority. Jesus as Christ.
Casting out demons.
Oh, cast out demons, feeds. Crowds, they're happy, all this good stuff. A lot of good stuff going on with Jesus as Christ. Almost more the way they kind of expected of Christ, to sort of fix things. And that's what Jesus is as the Christ. And we know that because when we look at Caesarea Philippi, and in chapter 8, Peter says, you are the Christ. So clearly, at least in Mark's mind or in Peter's mind, Jesus has done what is necessary to establish himself as the Christ. This is what the Christ means, at least according to the evangelist Mark. Okay, so we've done that. And then he shifts gears and he starts talking about what? Now he starts talking about death. And when he starts talking about death, we're really in the second part of the gospel. And the second part of the gospel, if the first part has to do with Jesus as the Christ, the second part has to do with Jesus as Son of God. Now, we in the story first, we're Christians. Everyone who read the Gospel of Mark were Christians. So they knew the story. Basically they knew the highlights. So this is not a document to convert people. It's something to inform people, who already believe, to sort of help them better understand what they believe, who it is they follow. And so we know, but even in the story we know, because even before we get to Jesus talking about what it means to be Son of God, we've been told he's the Son of God. Who's told us? Mark's told us, chapter 1, verse 1, Mark told us that he's the Son of God. Who else has told us in the story?
Peter. The demons.
Well, not Peter, but demons did, because we don't have a human being. No human being will do it. Demons will, and Satan will, and who has the most credibility at all? God has said. That's right. And even if in the baptism, he says, you are my beloved son, which means he's talking to Jesus. At the transfiguration, he uses third person, he is. So Peter, James, and John hear that on Transfiguration Mountain. So God, and we the reader, heard both of them. So we've already heard that he's a son. We already know he's the Son of God. But the people in the story don't seem to. And so Jesus is establishing. And as a matter of fact, what happens to the groups that we've been kind of focused on as Jesus starts talking about himself as the Son of God? And he won't even use the title. If you notice in that second part, he won't call himself Son of God, he'll call himself Son of Man. And that becomes kind of that's the title he uses for himself, which is everybody's a son of man. But that's the title he ends up using for himself because he's not ready. He hasn't done what the Son of God needs to do. Okay, so what has happened to these groups that have sort of been in the background around Jesus as this message has shifted?
the disciples don't seem to be following him anymore. They want to try to lead him in a different direction.
The disciples are kind of a confused bunch. They never really were that sharp early on, but they followed him. There was a lot of, we don't know, we're afraid to ask him, geez, this guy can do this, whoa, what does that show? They weren't saying, oh, we worship you. They were always kind of questioning. They were always a little confused anyway. But now they're doing some things that aren't really very nice. Like fighting among themselves over who's important right after Jesus says, how do you measure importance in the kingdom of God?
The first will be last.
The first is going to be last is going to be first. So if you want to be first, you got to be
last.
You got to be a servant of everybody. And what are they fighting about?
Who's going to serve?
Yeah,
sit where?
yeah. Who's going to sit on the right side and the left side? They're. It's like my mother used to say: in one ear, out the other. That it doesn't even seem to hover for these disciples.
In some defense, I know the inferences that Mark is showing that the apostles aren't anybody to look up to necessarily. But it says that the carnal mind is enmity against God. Mm-hmm. They don't have the Holy Spirit yet, so their mind can't begin to grasp what's going on unless, it would be given to them by the Holy Spirit. So, just to cut them a little slack,
Well, yeah, and like I said, one of the things that's fascinating, and we'll see this if we want to look at John, how they're presented in John
way different.
Is going to be way different. And how Jesus presents himself in John, way different. So you'd read the two and you'd almost say, well,
It's not the same.
yeah, this isn't the same person. This isn't the same situation. Other than a few events, of course, the big one, the crucifixion, resurrection. But outside of those, there aren't even a whole lot of events that are similar when you compare John to Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So you'd say, whoa, this is a whole different perspective. Well, it is. And that's why you need both. You take both of them together, and now you've got something. Now you can see Jesus in two different ways. And the disciples, probably the strongest is when you look at Luke and the disciples in Luke, because the disciples in Luke, not only do they not come off looking too bad, but they actually are pretty important because Luke has Acts, and the church is going to be built on what? Going to be built on the apostles. The apostles are going to be the leader of the church. So he's not going to undermine the apostles during Jesus' life because he sees them as the pillars of the church. So and we take that as word of God, which gives us a different perspective on the apostles as well. As we compare the different evangelists.
It's like two people going through the same experience. And one sees the positive of the experience and the other sees the negative of the experience. It depends on your focus and what your objective is.
Absolutely. I've said this before. I love history. Love history. There was so I've read a lot of history surveys, and one of them that I find just fascinating is one written by a guy named Paul Johnson. And Paul Johnson, I'd never read anything like what he wrote. Now, I don't necessarily agree with it. I think his interpretation, is questionable in a lot of areas. But the most important president, he's the greatest president we ever had. The greatest, he put as number one president in U.S. history. You know the one? What's that?
Is it Tyler?
Wasn't Tyler. Oh, Tyler, that would be really an interesting interpretation. And by the way, John Tyler, 10th President of the United States, has a grandson who's still alive. Yep. Died in 1862, John Tyler. Has a grandson that's still alive. Had 15 kids. Okay, but yeah, so it's not Tyler, unless you see kids as a real plus. Greatest president. Now, if you were just looking without me setting it up like that, greatest president in the United States, Abraham Lincoln, right? comes on the top on a lot of lists. When Abraham Lincoln isn't on top of the list, it's George Washington. I tend to think George Washington is the greatest president, because everything he did was setting a precedent. But Washington, Lincoln, there's a few Franklin Roosevelt scattered in there. But it's going to be maybe Thomas Jefferson up there in the top 5. These would be the ones that, people would look at. Paul Johnson says, Calvin Coolidge, Silent Cal, the man weaned on a pickle. That's the best, greatest president. Different perspective. And he justifies it. He explains why. It's not like he just said, I had a dream and I saw Coolidge. He has these reasons why he sees him as the greatest. You look at those reasons and you say, oh, okay, well, I know what he's thinking. I may not agree, but I know where he's coming from. That's kind of what's going on with the Gospels. We're looking at 3 different perspectives on Jesus. And if we're smart, I think, if we're wise, not even smart, more like wise, because wisdom is acquired. If we're wise, then we say, let them each speak. Let's let each of them speak. And let's take something from each one so that we have a more rounded picture. We don't have to say, well, I don't agree with John. I'm a Mark man, so I'm going to reject the other 3. Don't want to do that. I want to take all of them, even though we know they're slightly different. That's okay. The people who put together the Bible, they could have just taken one. I mean, they weren't stupid. They knew they were putting 4 books in that weren't identical. Well, if they did it, why wouldn't we want to do it? And there were hundreds of them in circulation, so they could have put in 5 if they wanted. They could have put in 6 if they wanted, because there were plenty of them around. They chose 4. And I believe inspired by the Spirit, these are the 4 that we claim. So anyway, he's talking about what it means. So we've got the disciples. What about the other groups? As he's shifted gear, what about the scribes and the Pharisees? How are they in the second one? Now they're really going to get him, but they wanted to get him in chapter 2. So there's no great difference. They've kind of been the same. And they wanted to, but they're still gunning for him. Only now, it's not just the scribes and the Pharisees. It's the Herodians are with them, and the Sadducees, because the chief priests are there. So it's like this whole Jewish establishment.
A new information has come through. Archaeologists and atheists have always said that in the other Gospels, they mentioned the high priest Caiaphas. And Caiaphas, there's no record of him anywhere in history of that time or anything. And they just found what they do in Israel and stuff, or the Jews at this time, was they would put the body in the tomb for a year. Then they would go in and there'd be just bones, and they would collect the bones and put them into in the vernacular, a bone box. There's an actual name for it, but I can never remember it for some reason. And so they found one recently when they were doing some excavating for building a building, like they always do. They come across these and stuff, and in the tomb was the bone box of Caiaphas. And it was obviously a rich man that had high status by the ornateness of it. So now they have historical proof of a Caiaphas at that time that was high ranking. So it gives credence to the fact that, when it mentions Caiaphas as a high priest, that he actually existed.
Yeah, well, and that's good. Yeah. That's good. Okay, so but they're the same. What's the other group? We've been talking about crowds, the aklos. And what do we know about aklos? What do we know about the crowds?
They don't know. Where are they staying?
We don't know. Well, yeah, we the reader, know what happens at the end. But as Mark's presented it, where are the crowds standing? Are they for him? Are they against him? We don't know.
They were just for him.
They were
welcoming him into Jerusalem, and then a couple of days later, it's Philip.
And it's just this odd thing, because the scribes and the Pharisees, they seem to know, or they suspect, they assume that the crowds are for it. In fact, it's kind of interesting. they never say, and it's one that you kind of read through and not necessarily, think about. They never say, oh, we're afraid of the disciples. The scribes and the Pharisees never say, oh, we're afraid of the disciples. They say we're afraid of the crowd, the aklos, the crowd. Yeah. And which means they seem to assume that the crowd is not only pro, which they are, but they're willing to die for it. They're willing to fight for it. And they don't seem to be nearly as worried about the disciples doing that as they do the crowds.
And it bears out when...
That's exactly right. We're going to see it right here. That's exactly... Mark is going to great pains to keep this suspense because Mark's a good writer. So if there's this suspense, this tension, where are the crowds going to align? What side are they going to be on? And to this point, everything he's written has kind of moved us to... They're going to stand up for it. They're going to be there for it. Okay, so we're here. Jesus entered Jerusalem, right? Big fanfare, although in Mark it's a little more subdued than you see in the other Gospels. A little bit more subdued. Because you don't have, like in John, where it says everybody is now following Jesus. You don't have, like we said in church in Luke, where the stones themselves will cry out loud. It's a more subdued entry into Jerusalem in Mark, but it's still the disciples are there. There's a cleansing of the temple. We've got a reorientation. He confronts the last of the opponents. He talks about the future. He has a meal with his disciples, which reinforces the idea of communion, something Mark's church is evidently doing, and so he wants to give it that root in the life of Jesus himself, in that story, and goes to Gethsemane. The disciples have the last chance, and we know they got a chance to at least obey Jesus when he goes to pray, and they fall asleep. Mm-hmm. Right after he said, you got to stay away. Uh-huh. You got to stay away, and they immediately go to sleep. And Jesus in the prayer says, what becomes really significant in this Gethsemane prayer in Mark?
If it can pass, let it pass.
Let it pass. Please, God, let this cup pass. But your will be done. And I think there Mark gives us that guide. We don't have a Lord's Prayer in Mark. We've got that in Matthew and Luke. But we do, I think, have an example of prayer at Gethsemane. It's okay to ask for God to please let this pass. Please let it pass. I don't want it. I recognize your will's going to be done. Help me accept your will. And that becomes really, at least for me, a real powerful prayer and a hard one for a person to make. Easy to make the first half, hard to do the second. Really hard. And yet that's what we see in the Psalms. That's what the psalmist does. Same sort of thing. Okay, so Jesus does it. They're asleep again. What happens now? Now we're looking at chapter 14, beginning at verse 43. So we've got all this thing that has gone on. Now Jesus, when he had the meal with his disciples, he predicted two things that we know are going to happen. Well, actually three things. What are the three things he predicted?
He's going to be betrayed.
He's going to be betrayed.
Peter is going to deny him.
Peter's going to deny him, and
he's going to die.
And we're going to die. And what's going to happen to the rest of them? Going to run away. Like sheep scattered without a shepherd. Everybody's going to run away. Peter's going to deny him, and one of the 12 is going to betray him. We know who's going to betray him because Mark has already told us. That he told us way at early on. And just a little while ago, he told us about Judas going to the Jewish leaders and offering to betray him. So, verse 43, the prayers are done. Jesus says, let's get up. We got to go. Things are happening. What happens in verse 43?
The crowd comes with swords.
Who is leading this crowd? Who is, or at least with this crowd? Judas. And just so that we know, because remember, this, I talk about we're the reader, and we are. But the people who are experiencing the Gospel of Mark are not reading it. You realize they're not reading it. They're hearing it. Because papyri, you don't have books out there. So if you got a document, somebody is reading it out loud, and it's a scribe, because a scribe can read the chicken scratch that they call writing. He could separate the words. So all of this is being read. So, that's why sometimes things are repetitive. They're writing to folks who are hearing this and not reading it. And when you're hearing something, you can't go back and say, oh, this looks familiar. Let me check. Yeah, he said this back here. You got to rely on your own memory. Okay, so Mark tells us Judas is, in case you forgot, Judas is what?
One of the 12.
One of the 12, and he's going to be he's a betrayer. He's a betrayer, but he's also one of the 12, both of which I think is really important. Clearly, Mark wants to emphasize that one of the 12 is a turncoat, is a traitor. Okay, Judas comes out, you got a mob with him, and they are armed with swords, and they're with clubs, right? He also tells us who sent them.
Chief priest.
Okay, the chief priest. Now it says the nations, in my translation it says nations leaders. It doesn't say that in the Greek. I wish that wasn't the translation, because that becomes kind of, the use of nation becomes really significant. It's not, so if you got it in that's not what it says. It's just sort of the leaders of the people and the teachers of the law of Moses. So the Jewish leaders have sent this group to arrest Jesus. And what was the code? Okay.
Kiss.
The man I kiss, you tie him up and lead him away. And what does he do?
He kissed him.
He kisses him, right?
Yeah.
And he calls him
Rabbi.
Teacher. Well, my goodness gracious, we've talked about that before. Teacher is not a title of faith. It just plain isn't. It's maybe respect, but it's not a faith title. That's why Judas and the scribes and the Pharisees can call Jesus teacher. That's not a sign that they understand who he is. Okay? And what happens at the arrest? So they come, kisses him. No, Jesus doesn't say anything in Mark. None of you betrayed me with a kiss. That's somewhere else. But what happens after he's arrested?
One of them cuts off.
One of them, somebody standing there cuts off an ear, which, since that appears in the other Gospels, that's part of the tradition. Now, the other Gospels will do different things with it.
They name the people.
Yeah, we'll name the people. They will name yes. And we'll have Jesus heal, the woman. Not in Mark. Because clearly for Mark, this is what? Is not important. It's in the tradition, but for Mark, this isn't, who did it isn't important. The fact that Jesus healed him, that's not important. It's just not relevant. Kind of, it makes a little sense that he wouldn't identify him, because he doesn't want these disciples to appear heroic. Not in the way he's presenting this.
Well, he wants the folks to stay on Jesus Christ rather than the people that were on the other side.
Right, and Peter is not going to step up and bravely defend him. I don't think Mark wants even to get into that. Because I think Mark wants us to have a fairly negative view of Peter for whatever reason. Whatever reason Mark
wants.
After
they cut his ear off and stuff, he decided to become an artist.
Why do you say that?
Van Gogh.
Oh, there you go. Oh, a little French art humor. You can't beat it.
Well, you did it with tires, so.
That's exactly right. Anyway, so Jesus. Now, how does Jesus respond?
Says, am I leading a rebellion? I'm around all the time. Why do you have to come out here like this?
Yeah, but
the scripture has to be fulfilled.
Scripture's got to come true. Okay. Now, how do the disciples respond?
They run away.
I love it.
Yeah.
The disciples, Jesus' disciples, ran away
Deserted them.
and left him. Ran away. Now, who is it that's running away? All of them. All of them. Right?
Yeah.
Now, are we
They finally
surprised?
woke up, huh?
Yeah, they woke up. Yeah, that's right. They couldn't
Yeah.
stay awake while he was praying, but they're plenty awake now. Now, are we surprised by that?
Not the way they
Heck no. They've acted like goofs before, like they're misunderstanding. And at the dinner, Jesus said,
It's gonna happen.
you strike the shepherd, the sheep's going to run. And that's what's happening here. And in fact, Mark wants to emphasize it. I think Mark wants to put such a strong emphasis on the fact that these disciples are running away. He adds something to their flight.
He ran away too.
Well, at least what he writes, he says, a young man runs away, and he is in such a hurry.
They
His
took
no
his
clothes on.
Yeah, he's streaking. This young man is streaking.
The first streaker.
Yeah, yeah, he is. Yes, he left his clothes behind and he ran. Now, man, you have got to want to get away fast. If you're running and you leave your clothes behind. Again, I think this is Mark emphasizing, that these people, and for a Jew, nakedness was one of those things that Jews just didn't do. People, they were really uncomfortable with that. In fact, one of the things that Pilate did that caused him to be loved by the Jews. Loved by the
He wore
Jews.
clothes.
Well, Jews did not like nakedness. And one of the things that they really objected, one of the reasons for the Maccabean rebellion is the Ptolemies and the descendants of Antiochus, the Greeks, they wanted to establish a gymnasium in Jerusalem because that's what they had in all the towns. And when people in the gymnasium were doing their gymnastics, they did it sans clothes. They did it in the all together. So I want you to just imagine going to a gym now. Close your eyes and imagine your friends are exercising buck naked.
Oh,
Or as we would say, starkus. Okay, so anyway, that's what the Greeks did. And the Jews, Jews were not happy. One of the things that because Pilate said the disciples, shouldn't call the disciples jerks, because they were just weak and confused. Pilate was a jerk. He really was. And eventually he was fired and transferred because he was a jerk, and people complained, and the Romans did not want a jerk for governor because that means you have to put more police in, and Romans didn't like to spend money, and yada yada yada. But what Pilate did, not only would he come into the city with his eagles, with the Roman eagles, which really ticked the Jews off, and smart governors would leave the eagles outside of Jerusalem because they saw them as graven images and would put them aside. Like if people were uncomfortable with flags, you were in an area and people were uncomfortable, would leave the flags outside. You don't have to carry it in. So he'd leave the Roman eagles, most of the governors, leave them outside, and the people would be, as happy as they could be with the Roman. They were placated. Good. Particularly the Sadducees, the righteous ones. But not Pilate. He'd march in with his little eagles and would tick people off for no good reason, other than he was being a jerk. Something else he used to do, along the city, he would put his Roman soldiers, guards, up along the walls of the city, because if there was anything that happened down below, it wasn't to defend the outside. Nobody's going to attack from the outside. But if there was a riot or something below, you had your soldiers high, easier to deal with going downhill than trying to go uphill. And so he would station his soldiers around, but he would have his soldiers not wear underwear in their little skirts, which didn't bother the soldiers because it was hot. But as the Jews were looking up, they could see the moon during the day because those Roman soldiers were mooning the population below. And Pilate did it just to be a jerk because he knew Jews were really uncomfortable with nakedness. So he made sure, I don't know his point, who knows? his boy. But that's what he did, and so that's why they just plain hated him even as a Roman governor. They just really hated him. So he was a big jerk. Anyway, the fact that he's running away, Mark says this young Jewish boy is running away buck naked. Man, that is really bad. Bad for anybody. Really bad for a Jew. That's just something Jews didn't do. Anyway, so this guy is still, and he may still be running. Where do they take Jesus? They immediately take him to the high priest. And who is there with the high priest?
All the Jews.
Okay, all the leaders are there with the high priest. Now, who is following? And I love the way Mark said it. Somebody's following, but he's following at a distance. Remember, like I told you, papyrus is really expensive. So any word Mark uses, it's costing him some money to use it. So the fact that he added at a distance shows that he really wants us readers to know that Peter isn't just right there with him. He's practicing social distancing. Practicing social distancing.
Extreme.
Oh, maybe they had COVID.
maybe. Yeah, I think they had COVID. So Peter's at a distance, and Mark tells us he does what?
He sits with the guards.
Okay, he's sitting with guard around a fire. Okay. Now, Jesus is, and that's just sort of an insertion, but we know Peter's going to play a role because Jesus said he would. Now, when they take Jesus to the leaders of the people, what's their goal?
Having him convicted.
They want to have Jesus convicted. Or they want enough that they can take him to Pilate with charges that are going to stick, right?
Yeah.
And so what do? Because they are not stupid people.
They bring in witnesses.
Okay, they bring in witnesses, and they bring in a bunch of false witnesses. But according to Mark,
they can't get this
story straight. They can't get that story straight. Now, historically, could you get a bunch of people to get your story straight? I mean, if you are conducting the trial, I mean, we're not talking about, they had an independent prosecutor in there who was nonpartisan and had no dog in this fight, and they were presenting evidence to him. That's not what it's. They're presenting it to people who 100% of them want to see Jesus dead, and the guys they bring in can't get their story straight. Now, historically, that would seem to be kind of doubtful, because you could give them cards and say, read the card. Why would Mark have that? Why would Mark say they bring in these false? Because he could just say they brought in false witnesses and move on. Who cares if the false witnesses don't get the story straight? They're still false witnesses. Mark told us they're false, which means they're lying.
They wanted everybody to know Jesus was innocent.
Yes, I think that is exactly right. I don't think Mark doesn't want Jesus convicted. He wants us to know that he was convicted by lies. That there wasn't any legitimacy at all to Jesus' conviction. So even the liars couldn't lie well. So Jesus' conviction is going to be based on something. Well, they can't get the lie straight. But what happens there? So the false witnesses are
they
next.
asked Jesus a question.
They asked Jesus a question, right? And throughout all of this, Jesus has taken what stand?
Quiet.
He's been, and why would, again, that be appropriate given the fact that you got false witnesses?
How can you refute a lie?
Yeah, okay, he's not going to respond to a lie. So Jesus is not. Now, would we respond to a lie? Yeah. If somebody came and said, I saw Ed Rudiger was doing da-da-da-da-da, I'd sure as heck say, I was not, but Jesus is, because I'm not Jesus. But Jesus is not going to even respond to a lie that's being told, right? So no lie. And then they ask him
Are you
the question. And it is fascinating when they ask him the question. What question do they ask him?
Are you the Christ,
the Son of God?
The blessed one?
I'm experiencing deja vu all over again.
Yeah, first, from chapter 1.
Chapter 1, verse 1.
Yeah.
They are saying it. It's like Mark is putting this in. Here it is. The story is coming to the conclusion. right?
Yeah.
We're coming into the for a landing, because what I said this whole book is about is showing up right here. Okay? Now, we, the audience, know the answer is
Yeah.
duh. Yeah, duh. Because that's what Mark says, verse 1, chapter 1. That's what God has said. That's what Peter said, at least half of it. So we already know that.
But how, since nobody had mentioned, not even him, that he was the Son of God, he said he was the Son of Man, how did they come to the conclusion he was the Son of God?
Which means this is, I think, something Mark is shaping. Because I think Mark is telling the reader.
Yeah.
You know, because, I mean, he wasn't in the back of the room taking dictation. You know, this is Mark kind of bringing it to the head. If Jesus is going to be convicted, he's going to be convicted of what?
For doing good.
That's right. That's exactly right. He's going to be convicted of being the Christ, the Son of God. That's going to be the conviction. You know, it's not going to be convicted for any other reason.
They put over a sign that his crime was being the Son of God.
But that's not what they're going to put over him. They're going to say King of the Jews, you know, above him. But which there's an irony there too. But Jesus is going to be convicted for being what? Who Jesus is. That's going to be the conviction. And it's really interesting because Jesus' response is what? I am, which is powerful because in Greek it's ago me. And ago me is powerful. You know, for English, I am sounds emphatic, but ago me is...
When they asked him, who are you? When Moses asked him, who are you? He says, I am that I am. So
That's
every time
right.
he says, I am, he's saying, I'm God.
In the Septuagint, when which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, when Moses asked the burning bush, well, who should send me? The bush says,
I am.
ago me, ago me.
Yeah.
Whoa, ago me. Which is an emphatic pronoun, first person singular. I myself am. You know, so you're doubling that. Okay, and that's so when he says ago me, and heck, if we look at John, ago me is a big deal. There's ago me all over the place in John. But here he says this, but it's really interesting because after he says it, then what does he say?
You'll see me sitting with God.
And you know, but it's interesting. He doesn't say you'll see the Son of God. He says you'll see
The Son of Man.
the Son of Man. You know, so even though he'll say yes to what they said, he's still not using that title for himself. He's not claiming that title yet for himself because he hasn't done it. He hasn't done it. You know, he hasn't displayed himself, Son of God. So anyway, but the answer he gives is true, right? And at the truth, what's the response?
Rip my clothes.
Yeah, they start tearing their clothes, and then what do they say?
Do we need any more witnesses? I mean, he just
Don't
said
need
it.
it. This is enough. So there's absolutely no question, just like you were saying earlier on when they decided to kill him, they decided to kill him because he chose to do good on the Sabbath rather than evil. You know, right now they're going to kill him because he admitted to being who he is, who we know him to be. So we, the reader, know this is the call. This is the truth. It's not any of this baloney about rebuilding the temple. That's a lot of baloney. You know, this is the reason they're going to kill him, because he's the Christ, the Son of God. Okay. And again, a little irony, because he never says I'm the Son of God. Or they say, what should you say? We heard him claim to be God. Well, he didn't claim to be God. You know, remember they were going to kill it. They were mad at him when they accused him of forgiving sins. You know, with the paralytic, and he didn't forgive sins. What he did was announce forgiveness. He didn't announce God's forgiveness. You know, he says the Son of Man. He says Son of God. Even Son of God is a title in like 2nd Psalm that was associated with the Davidic kings. So I mean, even then, Son of God doesn't mean divine. You know. But so he never claims to be God, but that's what they're doing with it. Same thing they've done before. So they've got the reason And once they do that, what do they start doing to him?
Beating them.
They start abusing him. You know, they start beating him and stuff. Okay.
Spitting on him.
What's that?
And spitting on him.
And spitting on it, yeah.
Yeah.
Which is gross.
Yes.
Yeah, that's really. I think that's beyond. You know, that's not necessary.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's not necessary.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I'd rather have somebody spit on me than punch me.
Well,
Just a thought.
yeah, well, that's an excellent point. That's an excellent point.
Disgusting, but
Yeah, you can get a towel. Oh, well, okay. So now, because Mark is a good writer, you know, he really is a good writer. We have this going on inside. What's happening? You know, if you visualize it like a movie, you know, we've got sort of fading out, fading in. Who is in the courtyard?
Oh, Peter's out there.
Okay, Peter is in the courtyard. And what happens to Peter?
he gets recognized by
He
the,
gets
Oh,
recognized.
yeah, the lady from the high priest.
Yeah,
servant.
okay.
Yeah.
A servant says, what?
You're with him, aren't you?
Right? You with him? And Peter, being a strong and noble man, says,
Knowing his
What are you
commandments.
like?
I love it. It's not even, no. It's,
No.
have you ever had somebody do this? And as soon as they do this, you know they're lying. You know, when you say something, and instead of saying, no. They say, absolutely not. I wasn't there. I don't even know the person. I had never been there. You say, you know, thou dost protest too much.
Yeah.
So you don't know what you're talking about. You know, which is kind of a Gary Coleman thing. And then what does the girl say? Yeah, I'm thinking you're one of them. And Peter says,
No way, Jose.
heck no way, Jose. That's right. You know, because he's from southern Palestine. Then what happens? Yeah, south of the border.
Because of how you talk, we know you are.
Yeah, you got that funny northern accent.
Oh, no,
You know,
it's
like
not.
folks from Pennsylvania, northern Pennsylvania, you know, going down south. That's what, y'all Yankees talk funny. Gee, I don't know anything about people saying you talk funny. So they say he denies it again, and he's not just denying it, he's cursing, and it's just awful. And then, yes, would you do that again, Don? That was really good.
I heard a song called Ghost Chicken.
Oh, golly.
Take off the Ghost Riders in the sky, but they do Ghost Chicken. It's funny as heck, 'cause it's supposed to be the rooster funny, so they laugh, and you make the people be the rooster and stuff.
Oh.
Song. And she always goes, "You sound terrible as a rooster." Now I know why.
You were really good. Any other farm animal? Well, no, that's maybe not. That's okay. That's okay. Anyway, so now once he does that, and then Peter remembers. You did yours, and Peter knows, and he cries. But you know, remember in the Gospel of Mark, this is it for Peter. You know, all the other Gospels, Peter shows up again at the resurrection. You know, Peter is
At
a
least
place.
he stuck around longer than the rest of them.
Yeah, maybe.
Go through the rest
He stuck
of them.
around long enough to deny him.
Yeah, but the
You
rest
know,
of them didn't even make
run
it
away.
that far.
Yeah.
Well, he had no choice.
Yeah.
He was going to deny him 3 times.
Yeah.
It was a prophecy.
What is Jesus' situation? Now that Peter has done
He's
this.
got to go to court.
Wait, and he's going to court alone.
Love
There's nobody else following him. But we still have the trump card.
That
We
crowd.
still have the crowd. We don't know about the crowd. So what do the leaders do?
They take him to Pilate.
Okay. The leaders take him off to Pilate. Pilate was a real jerk, but his jerkiness isn't conveyed here at all, and isn't in any of the Gospels. Now, just think about this. Why would the evangelist... You're not going to sound like a chicken again. No. Rooster. What would motivate the evangelist to be a little gentle with the Romans? Yes?
Because he's writing at a time that Rome is still in charge and they don't want the Romans being blamed, so the people revolt.
And his church is in Rome.
Christians, tiny little group. You know why the Romans aren't persecuting Christians now?
Because
at this time?
they don't have any power.
They're tiny little group. They aren't even on the Roman radar. You know, the Jews are, but the Christians aren't. They just aren't that important yet. You know, just not enough of them to be important. The last thing the early church wants to do is to really tick off the Romans. You also have a problem. And and we've talked about this before, we talked about it earlier. There are certain problems that the church has to answer for it to make, so there are problems. The baptism, which evidently everybody knows because it's in all four Gospels, Jesus is baptized. That's a problem for the early church because baptism had to do with sin. And if Jesus is sinless, why is he being baptized? So that's a problem that some of the evangelists answer, some of them don't. You know, Matthew spends a lot of time trying to answer why he's being baptized. But Mark doesn't seem to care. But that's a problem. Another problem is the way Jesus dies. Because Jesus dies on a Roman, and a Roman criminal. He dies on a Roman cross. And he doesn't die as a Jewish criminal, like Stephen, who was stoned. Some of the evangelists, how do you explain? Well, we can't kill people. Jews were killing people all over the place. I mean, they had capital punishment. The Romans, they were happy with the Jews executing prisoners, their own prisoners. Then the Romans didn't have to get their hands dirty. They weren't bothered by that. But an evangelist is trying to struggle with, how do I explain to Christians later why Jesus died on a Roman cross and why he wasn't stoned, why he wasn't crushed by a stone? Well, that's just kind of that's what they all struggle. But how do I do that? Because clearly he was, because it's in all the traditions. He was nailed on a cross. How do I have him die on a Roman cross, but not have the Romans responsible for his death? And that's what what they're really struggling with. How do I present his death in a way that who's going to be responsible? The Jewish leaders are going to be responsible. How do I present that in a way that makes them accountable, even though I know the Romans are the ones who drove the nails?
Well, the high priest had let his death, and all that fall on us.
Well, that's right. And so all the evangelists, when you look at the story, that's what they're all doing. And, some do it more dramatically than others. Luke is real dramatic. Pilate's washing his hands, of it. So, we don't see in Mark, but how do I make it the responsibility of the Jewish leaders, and not the responsibility primarily of the Romans?
Do you think that he was crucified by the Roman way because that allowed his death to cover the world's sin? Because the death was
not just for the Jews.
Was a universal. It was a non. Yeah, could be. What's interesting, and I've never thought of it that way. You don't see any of the people who wrote the Bible use that, but that would have been good if Peter or Paul had written. This is what. This is. They never said. He died on a cross and not by stones because his death was for all people and not just for the Jews. That would be the kind of argument you'd expect to hear, because that's a good one to explain why he dies on a Roman cross.
But the prophecies and everything else, 22nd Psalm and stuff, they all point to him dying on a cross.
Well, it's
being crucified.
It's one of these things that the church has to deal with, and they do. That's what they have to deal with as they're looking back. Anyway, so they take him to Pilate. Boy, I'm thinking of that great line in Jesus Christ Superstar where they sing, "Take him to Pilate," and so they take him to Pilate, and what happens? What does Pilate ask Jesus?
Are you king of the Jews?
And this is wonderful. Pilate asks this because when he asks, "Are you king of the Jews?" What realm is he talking about?
Physical.
Okay, good, physical. He is not asking a theological question, which is what the priests were doing. Are you the Son of God? That's a theological question. Mm-hmm. Pilate is asking him
civil question.
A civil or political question.
Yeah.
Are you king of the Jews? Is that what you're claiming? Why would Pilate, the Roman governor, focus on the political?
Because he's the governor.
Because that's what he was there.
Job.
That's his job,
And
right?
if the Jews rebelled again and stuff like that, he was going to be in deep punishment.
You better believe it.
He was already on thin ice.
The theology, he really doesn't care about. He cares about the politics. And if there's a rival king, Pilate could be in trouble. Pilate could be in trouble. Now, understand, even though he uses it more here than Mark of all the evangelists uses less royal images for Jesus than the others. Doesn't talk a lot about Jesus being a descendant of David and all. Okay, so what do the Jewish leaders do? What do the Jewish leaders do?
They go home and fall asleep.
Well, no, not yet. Not yet. What do?
Crucify.
In verse 3, he's before Pilate. What do they do? They bring charges against him, right? And when Pilate questions him, what is Jesus' response?
No reply.
No reply.
Right.
Because Pilate's focused on the political and Jesus is not. So no reply, just like...
Well, he did
was
say,
before.
I am.
Well,
Are you the king of the Jews? And he said, I am.
Well, remember when he said I am
Yeah,
was
that was with
the Messiah, the Christ, Son of God. That I am. Here, we're not going to say that because Jesus' focus isn't political.
Mine said he says, I am.
Okay.
The king of the Jews.
This
Okay.
time he says, so you say.
So you say.
Yeah.
So you say. Which is not necessarily yes, but that's what you're saying. Mm-hmm. So maybe is, maybe isn't. I don't know. Could be. Now but Jesus isn't talking, right? And during the Passover, what's the tradition? That Mark introduces, because evidently his audience doesn't know it. So he introduces, says there's a tradition that the people around Passover follow, right? And what's the tradition?
Prisoner could be released.
to let someone. Yeah.
Somebody is going to be released for Passover.
Yeah.
Going to release somebody in Passover. And there happens to be, now I imagine there are a whole bunch of prisoners. I'm not thinking there are two in all of Jerusalem. But Mark is going to pick, it's only going to mention one of them, right? And who is the other prisoner? What's his name? Barabbas. And Mark tells us Barabbas is what?
He is a criminal.
Yeah, he's a criminal because he did what?
Murder?
He committed murder during a riot. Now, Barabbas is a real interesting name because Barabbas is Hebrew. And Barabbas literally means, do you know what Barabbas literally means? Son of a father. That's what it means. The son of a father. Now, the son of a father, that's not exactly like naming him after Uncle Gary or Granddad. Or his name is son of a father. Who is the son of a father?
Jesus.
Who is the son of a... Jesus is?
Yes.
Who else is? I am a son of a father. Craig is a son of a father. Everybody is Bus is a son of a father. Everybody's a son of a father, right? Every male is a son of a father, right? Because the name is so odd. You can't imagine a woman looking down at her little baby and say, ooh, I'm going to name you son of a father. That maybe the name represents kind of anybody. The who is not important. Barabbas is kind of a vague figure, and he disappears. After this, you don't hear about Barabbas again, just in this. But it's an odd name. It's one of those names that cause you to start thinking, what? What? That's not a popular name, son of a father. Anyway, so he said, not like Jesus, which means Savior, All right, so tradition, son of a father is standing there, going to set a prisoner free. Who does Pilate want to set free?
Jesus.
Wants Jesus. Who do you want me to free? The King of the Jews, which again is whose words? Because Pilate says, do you want me to king of the Jews? Remember Pilate said, King of the Jews, and Jesus said, that's what you say. And what is he doing? He's saying it again. Do you want me to free the King of the Jews? Now, what does Pilate seem to assume the crowd is going to say?
He thinks they will.
Yes, they're going to say, well, of course we're going to free Jesus.
Yeah,
and
why
then
would they let a murderer go?
Yeah, why would they let son of a father,
Yeah.
son of a gun, why would they let him go? This isn't a noble guy. Barabbas isn't a hero. Of course they're going to want to free, which again reinforces this idea that we've had, right? His opinion is the same as the Jewish leaders, right? Because the Jewish leaders have, to this point, been afraid of the crowds because if they arrest him, they seem to assume the crowds are going to stand up. Something the disciples are not worried about, but the crowds are going to stand up. And Pilate seems to make the same assumption, that the crowds are going to say, of course, release Jesus. What happens?
Sounds like the chief chief priest stirred up the crowd.
Mm-hmm.
They encouraged
To say,
release Barabbas instead.
right. And so the chief priest, so right now, we know where the crowd stand, right? Where did the crowd stand? With the chief priests. And in fact, if that wasn't clear enough, Pilate continues to push it. And what does he say to the crowd? Then if you don't want me to free Jesus, what do you want me to do with him? And what do they say?
Crucify him.
And he says, what crime has he committed? And they say,
Crucify him.
crucify him. Okay. So the crowd has made the decision. So the chief priests away from Jesus. The disciples away from Jesus. The crowds away from Jesus. Jesus is now truly alone, right? There's nobody on his side, with one exception. We'll talk about it later. If we're going to blame the crucifixion on anybody, who do we blame?
The crowd.
The crowds and the Jewish leaders.
Yeah.
That's who we're going to blame. Now, like I said, the problem of how is he going to die on a Roman cross, solved, right? Right here. They're going to die on a Roman cross, but who's going to be accountable? Jewish leaders. Now, in John, it appears as though things are a little different in John's, because it won't be just the Jewish leaders. It's going to be the Jews. So he'll use the Jews as the enemy. Here it's still Jewish leaders, because the church is probably mixed. Mark probably has a lot of Jews in his church, or former Jews. What did the soldiers do?
Tortured him.
Yeah, they do this ironic thing, right? And what do they do that's just gushing with irony? Although based on what Pilate said, it's based on what the words of Pilate used. What do they do to him?
They flogged him.
Yeah, they flog him. What do they put on his head?
They put the crown.
They put the crown of thorns, on his head. They put a purple robe on him, right? They make fun of him. They mock him by pretending, to honor him.
Hail, King of the Jews.
Yeah. Now, Jesus has never claimed to be King of the Jews. And remember, Mark was a little different because when he entered Jerusalem, they didn't shout King of the Jews. So, this is, I don't know how ironic this is. It's kind of based on what Pilate said. They took the clothes, they took the robe off, put him back in his clothes, and led him off to be nailed to a cross. Now, a couple of things just to file away. When they talk about beating him, one of the things that's really important for us to remember is the Romans used the cross as a deterrent. This was a deterrent. The Romans were very efficient and very good at what they did. And the cross was a deterrent. The last thing they would want is a prisoner whom they're going to nail on a cross. And they didn't nail everybody to a cross. But the people they nailed to a cross were the ones that really ticked off the Romans. Usually political reasons. They were political threats. Somebody who stole a cow is not a political threat. There are other penalties for that. But if you messed with the Romans, the consequences were serious. And the last thing they wanted was a prisoner to die in flogging, to be flogged to death. Because then you couldn't nail them on a cross, because they were already dead. You wanted a person to, and we'll see in how it's described here, you wanted the person to stay alive on the cross as long as possible. As long as possible. So that's why as he's carrying the cross, the Romans will do what? As Jesus is carrying the cross out of town, and that's where he's going to be crucified right on a hill beside the city gate. What do the Romans do?
They make another man.
They make another guy carry it. Why would they? You'd say, well, why would you do that? You want Jesus to suffer as much as he can. No. You don't want him suffering as he carries the cross. And you carry the cross through town, and people are mocking him, which kind of gives a whole different dimension to take up your cross, because this is where people really made fun of you. You walking through, and they were throwing stuff at you and that kind of stuff. But somebody else is carrying, because they did not want Jesus to collapse and die underneath this cross in the middle of the road, because that would cheapen the crucifixion. So they get to a place called Golgotha, which means
The place of the skull.
place of the skull. And Golgotha is really, really close to the city gate. Is a little hill where they would crucify. Why would they want to crucify him near the city gates? Why would you want to crucify? This is where the Romans crucified people in Jerusalem, by the city gates. Why would you want to do that? Everybody going into town,
Sees it.
everybody going out sees it. It is in a incredibly public place. So, like I said, the Romans crucified for deterrent. That's why they crucified. There were other horrible ways you could kill somebody, but this was to show you mess with the Romans, bad things happen. So, city gate. Now, one of the things, verse 23, what do they give him?
Wine.
They give him wine mixed with myrrh. Now, why would they give him wine mixed with myrrh? This is fascinating, and this tells us a lot about what crucifixion was all about. Why would they give him wine mixed with myrrh?
I've heard this before and I've forgotten.
To make them not relax.
That's it. You're exactly right. It's to kill some of the pain. They're giving this to him so he doesn't feel as much pain. Now, why in heaven's name would they give him something that would reduce pain?
Because he felt
So
sorry
he
for
can
him.
hang longer.
That's it. That's it.
He would
Because
hang longer.
if they start driving those nails, and he goes into shock, it's done. It's done. No crucifixion.
We don't realize, do we say nailed to the cross, and we just use that so,
Yeah.
freely, and you think about, I mean, I scraped my little finger on a nail the other day and thought,
And when you think about, and the fact what you said is right on, that it's such a horrible thing, and the reason, but they're doing it to keep him alive as long as they could. And when they and it says, and the nailing to the cross isn't in great detail. And that's why, things like The Passion of the Christ, which is my favorite movie for a lot of reasons. I don't like violence. I'm not a violent guy. Gore does not do much for me. But the evangelists don't emphasize the nailing to the cross. And they could. The soldiers took the nails, laid them down, took the hammer, pounded them. But all they said is nailed him to a cross.
even when they put those thorns down in his head, I mean, you got thorns.
Sure.
And I'm sure they just didn't lay it lightly.
No, that would be the fun of it, is to push it down and to make him bleed.
Did it say in here they screwed them into his head?
It could be,
Twisting.
Yeah, to get it so it's deep.
Yeah.
Now, of course, they didn't nailing to a cross. When the Romans nailed someone to a cross, again, the goal was to keep them alive, which is ironic. You'd think it'd just be the opposite, but it's keep them alive. They wouldn't have nailed in the hands. Why would the Romans never have nailed anybody in the hands? Why would that be the worst place to nail somebody?
Well, it would rip.
It would rip, right. If you're hanging there and you're nailed in the hands, you would, once you started to slump, it would tear, and then you wouldn't be nailed anymore. And so
Through the wrist.
they would nail through the wrist. So the wrist would give it. They were really good so they didn't hit arteries, because you didn't want somebody to bleed out. If they bled out on the cross, then they're not going to live very long. So nailed. Often they would tie, the arms, because the last thing you wanted was any possibility of coming loose. If you nailed feet, but one of the things that's a big problem, if you're nailing wrists and feet, as a nurse, if you're doing that, what is the person going to do? If they're on a cross and then your feet are secured and your wrists are secured, what will your body do? If you pass out, which is likely, what is your body going to do?
Slump.
It's going to slump, right? And if you slump, what's going to happen?
Fall forward.
You're going to fall forward, right? And even if you're secure, you're going to fall forward. When you fall forward, you're going to compress the lungs and you're going to suffocate, right? Because you're falling forward. And so the Romans would secure you and had a little seat where you would be sitting. So you wouldn't slump. So you were secure around your chest, you were sitting on a little seat, your feet were secure, your arms were secure. And the Romans had given you a sedative to make it less painful, because the Romans wanted you to do what?
Suffer.
They wanted you to die.
Slowly.
They wanted you to die slowly. So Jesus is nailed on the cross. Mark emphasizes the time. And I think one of the reasons he emphasizes the time is Jesus isn't going to be on the cross long. He's really not going to be up that long. People crucified would be up on the cross for hours, maybe days, because they would give you stuff to drink on there. They'd give you stuff to drink.
But he refused it.
But he refused. Yeah, and they would give you stuff to drink, and they'd give you, drugs, to keep you alert, because they would rather you die after 2-3 days with birds. You can't move. Birds doing their things, bugs doing their things, and everybody going in and out of the city could see it. And after you were dead, they'd leave you out there so they could see it. It's a deterrent. You see, that's what the Romans do to people who mess with Rome. Heck, after Rome burned, Nero crucified what was it, 5,000 Christians? Because he blamed the Christians for the fire in Rome. A tiny little sect, they couldn't bother him for the fire in Rome. And he lined them up on the Appian Way, the city road going into Rome, lined them up. Only Nero also set them on fire, which was kind of interesting. They did the same thing during Sparta. Spartacus did the same thing to the slaves, lined them up along the road. So you could come in. And if you mess with Rome, bad things are going to happen. Bad things are going to happen. So Jesus, evidently, the perception is Jesus messed with Rome. Put up the sign, not a shocker. What's the sign they put up on him above his head?
King of the Jews.
This is the King of the Jews, which becomes kind of a mocking thing. It says what's going on around him.
2 bandits, one on each
Okay, you've
side.
got 2 criminals that are also being crucified. And sometimes you see artwork. I've seen pictures of Jesus being, and the criminals not, different, look different. Now they would have been the same. I mean, it would have been the exact same. They'd have nailed them. They were nailed to a cross too. So you have Jesus and you got other people suffering with him. So Jesus is there suffering. And what are the people who pass by us, what are they saying?
They were mocking him.
Okay, they're mocking him.
Here in, I don't know if I'm too far, 31, he
Oh,
saved others.
Yeah,
But he can't
the
save
chief
himself?
priest. Oh, yeah, he saved others, can't save himself. Come down from the cross, right? And it's if he saved others but can't save himself. If he's the Messiah, King of Israel, let him come down to the cross, and we'll see and believe. And that's what they say. And why is that so ironic? As he's up there on the cross. Why is what they're saying so ironic? If he were really who he claimed to be, he'd come off that cross.
Yeah.
Why is that ironic?
He has to perfect
Because
all.
that's exactly what he came to do. That's the irony is that if he came down, we'll believe him. But he's doing exactly what he's supposed to do. That is exactly what he's supposed to do. Now, in Mark, as opposed to Luke, we got 2 criminals around him, right? Mm-hmm. And what are the 2 criminals doing?
Mocking him.
They're mocking him too. Which means even the ones who are suffering just like him, what are they doing? Mocking him. So Jesus on that cross is
Alone.
absolutely alone. The people down below are mocking him. The priests are mocking him. Even the two people that could identify with him, because they're suffering just like him. They're using their last breath to mock him, right? Mm-hmm. What happens at 3:00? What happens at noon? Sky turns dark. Mm-hmm. Good apocalyptic image,
Yeah.
darkened sky. What happens at 3:00?
That's when he dies.
Okay, around 3:00, Jesus says something. What does Jesus say?
Yeah.
Good Hebrew phrase. Eloi, Eloi, which means God. That's what Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. And what is he saying?
Why have you forsaken me?
My God, why have you forsaken me? And in Mark, how is Jesus feeling on that cross? What is he experiencing on that cross?
Just so alone.
Yeah.
Absolute loneliness.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
so good, the way you said it. He is without God on that cross. He feels as though God himself has abandoned him. Unlike the Gospel of Luke, where Jesus says, "To you I commend my spirit," or John, where he says, "It is finished." In Mark and in Matthew, the last words are, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Nothing about they don't know what they're doing. It is absolute despair and loneliness. Now the people around assume what when they hear that?
He's calling Elijah.
calling for Elijah. Now, why would that be significant that they assume he's calling for Elijah?
Because
What would it-
Elijah was coming back.
At the end of the world. When the world ended, Elijah would be the one. Because Elijah never died. So when the world ended, Elijah would come. And so what do they immediately do? When they think he's calling for Elijah, which means this is the end of the world. This is Judgment Day if Elijah comes down. What do they do? Fascinating what they do. Shows
They'll wait to see if he comes.
they want to see if he comes. What do they do as they're waiting to see that they come? What do they grab?
They filled a sponge with wine vinegar, put it on a stick and offered it to Jesus.
What are they trying to do?
Keep
Shut
him
him up.
Not trying to. I don't think they're trying to shut him up.
alive?
Keep him
Yeah.
alive. You know, they see he's in big trouble.
Yeah.
And they're going to give him some drugs to see, because if Elijah's coming to get him, Elijah don't want to find him dead. So let's keep him alive for just a few more minutes and give Elijah, a chance.
Time to get there.
Time to get there. That's it. Which shows that those people are clueless. They're clueless. But that's what they want to keep him alive. But what happens?
He does die.
He
breathes
shouts
his last
and
breath.
dies. And when he dies, what does it say in 38 happens?
The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom.
Now, now that's significant on a lot of levels. What's that curtain?
Covenant. Yeah.
Well, it is. It's sort of in the temple. You had different places in the temple, and there was a place in sort of the center of the temple called the Holy of Holies, and it had supposed to have the Ark of the Covenant there, and that is the place where God dwelt. That's where God dwelt, and to separate that from every place else was a curtain, and only one time a year one priest could enter the Holy of Holies. And it was separated by this curtain. The fact that when Jesus dies, the curtain is torn, why does that become significant?
We can approach God on our own.
That's it. We got something new. Something new has happened. But this isn't the first time this has happened in Mark. Do you remember the time the same sort of thing happened? And the word he uses is the exact same. This word is used twice in the Gospel of Mark. Once here and once somewhere else. This tearing. And the tearing is when you tear cloth. Do you remember when Mark used it before? When Jesus was baptized, all the other evangelists describe it, the heavens opened, right, and the Spirit descended. But that's how Mark described it. Mark says the heavens were ripped apart. Because this idea of ripping apart is like when you take fabric and tear it. You can't fix it. When you open something, you can close it. But when you tear fabric apart, you can't make it the way it was before. You can't do it. That's what's happening in the temple. And that's what happened at the baptism. This separation. Okay. And when this occurs, and this is the only thing that's mentioned. When you read the Gospel of Matthew, you've got earthquakes, you've got graves open, you've got dead people walking around, you got all this stuff going on. But this is the only thing that Mark says. But in verse 39, the most important verse in the second half of Mark, what happens in verse 39?
The centurion says that he truly is the Son of God.
So that you got a centurion at a cross, a Roman, which kind of points to maybe the Christianity is broader now than just Judaism because it's a Roman that's saying this. And what does Mark tell us motivates the centurion to say, truly he's the Son of God?
He stood in front of Jesus and heard his cry and saw how he died.
Saw how he died. Which tells us that how does Jesus show himself to be the Son of God? How does Jesus definitively show himself to be Son of God? if the centurion, and Mark is really careful in the way he phrases it, when the centurion at the cross saw how he died, he said, this man really was the Son of God. How does Jesus show himself? For Mark to be Son of God. What moved the centurion to say, that's the Son of God?
Is it the curtain?
Well, does it say he saw the curtain tear? No, it doesn't say
No, it
that.
doesn't.
It says
What-
about the loud cry and breathed his
What is
last.
the only thing Mark tells us the centurion saw? Mark tells us the centurion saw one thing.
How he had died.
Saw how he died. Saw how he died. How does Jesus, according to Mark, show himself to be the Son of God? He dies. He dies. And how does he die? He dies absolutely alone. He dies absolutely alone. When the centurion saw that, truly he's the Son of God. That's how Mark sees, I think, Jesus, the Son of God. Now, when you look at the Gospel of Matthew, that same verse, because after the curtain is torn, you have the earthquakes and you have dead people and you have all this stuff going on in Jerusalem. Matthew writes it, when the centurion saw these things, which means the centurion sees what? Earthquakes, sees, dead people walking around, sees all these things that now he says truly he's the Son of God. Because for Matthew, Jesus' death is sort of cosmic. It involves everything, life and death and creation. And the centurion sees all of this, and that's how he's Son of God. But in Mark, the centurion only sees one thing. Just sees how he dies. And that's what it means to be Son of God, is that you die. Now, why is that so important? Why would that be so important to see Jesus as the one who dies alone? Absolutely alone. Why is that so important? For us. For the centurion, for Mark's church, for us now. Why is that so important?
Well, Jesus alone took on all of our sins, and Jesus is the only way into heaven now. You have to have Jesus forgive you of your sins.
Patty, have you ever had hard times?
Huh?
Have you ever had hard times?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, hard times. When a person has hard times, as a Christian believer, what do we do when we have real hard times? What do Christians do when they have hard times?
Right.
You pray, right? You take them to God. Just like Jesus did when he was in the Garden of Gethsemane. So you take it to God. When we take those hard times to God, what do we know based on what Mark wrote? Of what can we be sure? Based on how Mark described this crucifixion, what do we know when we take those hard times, those fears, that pain to God?
That he's forgiving us of our sins.
He's forgiving us. What else do we know? You're right, but what else do we know? If you come to me and tell me something you've experienced in your life, I can say to you, oh yeah, man, that must be really hard. That must be really hard. Have I experienced it? Probably not. But I can imagine it's really hard. And I really can. But I haven't experienced. When we go to Jesus with our pain and our doubt and our fear, we know what?
He's gone through it.
He's
Yeah.
gone through it. He's gone through it. And I'll tell you, I've had so many conversations with Muslim friends. And I tell them, this is what sets Christianity apart from Islam, is Mark's crucifixion. Because when you go to God, in Arabic, Allah, which is Arabic for God, when you go to God and pray, you know your God, you believe your God understands. And that's wonderful. That's wonderful. I know that my God does more than understand because he experienced it. And that, to me, that makes all the difference. That God loved me that much that he would endure that in order to identify with me on my worst day. And that's the crucifixion in Mark. Now, does the crucifixion mean other things? You better believe it. You better believe it. For Paul, the death, Jesus took our sins. So when he died, we died for Paul. And therefore we're free from sin because dead men don't sin. And so when Jesus died, we died with him. Mark doesn't, that's fine. But that's not what Mark wants to focus on. He wants to focus on Jesus' identification with pain, which is God's identification with pain and suffering. And that is a big, big deal. In the book of Hebrews, I think, is really shaped by Mark. They sort of view God in the same way. That's what he talks about. We have a high priest who suffered as we did, but without sin. Okay, so Jesus dies, and that's for Mark. Now Jesus is the Son of God. Both of the two sections end with a confession. Peter at Caesarea Philippi, the centurion at the cross. One saying, you are the Christ, the other one saying, he's the Son of God. Now, I said that Jesus is absolutely alone with one exception. In verse 44, what is the exception? What's the exception? Jesus is all alone except...
He gave the body to Joseph?
Yeah, well, who even before? What do we see in 40 and 41? Who is there at a distance?
Oh, the women.
You have women. Now, have we run across women in Mark before? Yeah, but not a lot. Women haven't played a big role in Mark. But when you think back, they've always been pretty good. The Syrophoenician woman, the woman at Bethany who anoints him. So women they haven't played a big role, but they've been there. And the crowd has left him, the disciples have left him, the Jewish leaders have left him all by himself. But there are women at a distance. And Joseph takes the body. And what is Pilate's reaction when Joseph says, can I take the body? What's his first reaction? Which tells us again about crucifixion. What's his reaction?
He was dead.
Yeah. I'll tell you, somebody lost their job because of this. Because a crucifixion shouldn't be 4 hours. A crucifixion should be 4 days, not 4 hours. So Pilate was surprised that Jesus died so quickly, not that he lived so long. But they let him have the body. What does he do with the body?
Wraps it in linen and puts it in the tomb.
And who is there?
Mary.
Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, are watching and saw where the body was placed. And that's going to be important in chapter 16. Because in chapter 16, we're going to have what? What do you expect to happen in 16?
Resurrection.
Resurrection that will involve Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, as well as. So the women, now I want you to get this picture. All the men, and I think Mark has the highest view of women of all the evangelists. I really do. Because every man in the Gospel of Mark has disappointed Jesus. Every single one of them. The only one left is this little group of women. They're the only ones. And we'll see what they do in chapter 16. Okay. Any questions? This is Mark. The end of chapter 15. This is what Mark sees as important.
I have a question, it's not related
Yeah.
really to just the book of Mark though.
Sure.
I've had a Jehovah's Witness come to the house before, of course, and we had a conversation. And I said, well, do you believe that Jesus was crucified on the cross? And they said, well, not on a cross, on a tree. Why were they so insistent that it was a tree and not a cross?
One of the things that, again, becomes a real struggle in the early church. Let me take a half step back. In the early church, one of the goals seemed to be to look back into the Old Testament and find places where Jesus fulfilled prophecy. Something in the Old Testament. And Mark doesn't care about it. He doesn't do it very much. Sometimes, a couple of times he did, but not very much. Matthew is a big deal in Matthew. And because Matthew over and over again, you see, he did this to fulfill prophecy. He did this. Just read the first 2 chapters. Man, I bet you 4 or 5 times. Matthew says he did this to fulfill something. Because that's a big deal that he fulfills prophecy. Luke does it even more than Matthew, only he doesn't cite it. He doesn't highlight it. John doesn't do it at all. But particularly Matthew and Luke do it. So that becomes one of the goals, and I think that's to show that Jesus was who he said he was, if he fulfills prophecy. For them, it was a legitimate way to interpret Old Testament. Whether we would do that now, I don't know. Because you're kind of picking a verse. You pick one verse and take it out and say, ooh, this fulfills. Even though everything around the verse doesn't have to do with that. But you're taking that out and saying, okay, that's fine. That's fine. And I'm trying to think where. And I'm not sure. I think it's in the Psalms, in fact. Because you're looking at the whole, even non-prophetic work, you're saying is prophetic. That a figure is going to, no, it's a disgrace to be hung on a tree. It is a disgrace to be hung on a tree. And it's just like one verse thrown in among a whole bunch of verses. Well, when you're kind of scouring the Old Testament to find fulfillment, you see that and say, ooh, Jesus died on a cross. Cross is made of wood. Trees are made of wood. Jesus was killed on a tree. So it fulfills this prophecy. And that's what they were talking about. It's a Jehovah's Witness doesn't believe that Jesus was nailed to an oak tree. He doesn't believe he was just nailed to a tree. Mm-hmm. But he would choose to call the cross a tree in order for it to relate to the Old Testament. Yeah. And that's why that's why I assume they would do it. Yeah. I don't think most Jehovah's Witnesses would do that just because it made you feel awkward. And what they want to do is they want to convert you. And they don't want to make you feel, what? Mm-hmm. What? It would be an unnecessary confusion, which would interfere with them being able to do what they want to do. So they weren't real good at what they would, I don't think, because I don't think that's something that's going to lead a person to say, oh gosh, I never thought of it that way. Mm-hmm. It just becomes, what? Confusing, unnecessary. But that's what they're doing. Now, one of the interesting things, and this little tiny aside, the word Jehovah is fascinating because it doesn't exist. The word Jehovah doesn't exist. It is a non-word. Did you know that?
No.
You think Jehovah's Jewish, right? Yeah. Oh, Jehovah, name for God, Jehovah. It's a non-word. It's a word that doesn't exist. Remember I told you, back away, the name for God, 4 letters. In Jewish writing, they don't put vowels. Originally, they didn't have vowels in their written language because it was never intended to be read out loud. It's not an alphabet. It's not an alphabet. So you can't read a word that doesn't have vowels. And the Jewish language only had consonants. That was the only... I've got a copy of my Old Testament in my office. It's just consonants. To have it read aloud, you have to add vowels. because you can't say a word without vowels. And so what the Jews did with their words, and all Jewish words most Jewish words are 3 letters. That's the root. And then you add a prefix and a suffix to it to do different things. Make it plural, add a pronoun, that kind of jazz. But it's these 3 consonants. And what the Jews did was they added what are called vowel points underneath, little dots and dashes underneath these consonants so that you could pronounce the word. That's the only reason they added vowels, so you could pronounce it. With every word except one. And that was a name for God. And the name for God was never supposed to be said aloud. You were never supposed to say the name for God out loud. Because if I said the name for God, his proper name, Agoame, his proper name, then that would be using the Lord's name in vain. That would be using his name in vain because I'd be claiming his authority. It's sort of like if you get an agent to act in your name, I'm going to hire a lawyer to have power of attorney so he can sign checks in my name. That's the same concept. So if I use the name of God, I am assuming power. I'm assuming God's authority. And that's using his name in vain. You got no business using God's authority to do anything. So when you were reading it, when a cantor would read, the Hebrew would hit these 4 letters that are the name for God, proper name for God. They wouldn't pronounce those 4 letters. You couldn't because there's no vowels. And so what they would say is the word Adonai. They'd say the word Adonai, which is an entirely different Hebrew word. And that meant Lord in Hebrew, like the Lord of a castle, someone who has authority. So they'd say Adonai when they hit those 4 letters. When you look in the Psalms, in some of your Bibles, I don't know all of them, have you ever noticed that sometimes the word Lord is all capitals? It's capital L and then slightly smaller O-R-D, but they're all capitals. That's where the name of God appears. But they have put Lord because Hebrews would never pronounce the name of God, so you write the word Lord, but sort of in all caps, so you know that's where God's name was. And you say the name Adonai. That's why in the Greek version of the Old Testament, they translated that Kyrios, which means Lord. And that's why in the New Testament, when you see Lord referring to Jesus, that's kind of a loaded word. That's Kyrios. And Kyrios for a Jew became the name that a person reading the Old Testament would use for God. Anyway, if you take the vowels if you take the consonants for the name of God, and you take the vowels, just the vowels, from the word Adonai and combine them, you get the word Jehovah. You get the word Jehovah. So you're taking consonants from one word and vowels from another word. So you are doing what? You are creating a word that doesn't exist. That doesn't exist. Because you're taking letters from 2 different words and getting a new word. So the Jews would never talk about God being Jehovah because it means nothing in Judaism. The word Jehovah doesn't mean anything. It's not a Jewish word. So if you take the vowels from one word and the consonants from another, you get Jehovah. And so the whole idea of Jehovah rooted in the Old Testament, it just isn't because it's not a Jewish word. It's a created word. So that's the irony about Jehovah. They're bearing witness to the God of the Old Testament, but Jehovah's not the name in the Old Testament for God. So, there's a lot of other interesting things. But sometimes you may want to talk about that, about what different groups, like Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons and Christian Scientists.
Yeah.
I think it would be interesting because I don't know,
Yeah. Did Jehovah's, don't they just think Jesus is a prophet?
Yeah.
Not
that's
the
what I
Son of
always
God?
heard. Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
is
We
that
used to
right?
have a neighbor they were Jehovah's Witnesses.
Mm-hmm.
And they did not believe in celebrating a kid's birthday. They told our kids that they were going to die and go to hell because they were celebrating their birthday.
Oh.
Well, and gosh, I can't think of the court case, 1942. Used to know it. In 1942, and of course, what's happening in the United States in 1942? World War II, and we have just entered the war, right? And 1942, patriotism, we've entered this war, patriotism is a big deal. Big deal. In World War II, we're fighting for our survival, right? I mean, it is scary time. One of the things, that's when schools started to have every morning prayer and Pledge of Allegiance.
They're not allowed to say
Pledge of Allegiance.
Yeah.
Now, understand, the Pledge of Allegiance in 1942 was lacking the words, one nation under God. That wasn't in the pledge, but that was added in the 50s. But you had to do the pledge every morning. You did it by the flag, and it's really interesting when you look at it, and you can see pictures of classrooms of the kids are doing it to show respect for the flag. Mm-hmm. You know what the kids were told to do?
Did they have to sit down? I actually grew up with a girl that was Jehovah's Witness. She was in my class.
Hold on, the Jehovah, what the kid, just everybody did.
Oh.
Kids had to do. That was later. Initially, and this sounds crazy because we're fighting Germany and Japan, right? You see pictures of kids when this became, and school boards all over the country, this was a requirement now. You had to say, before World War II, patriotism wasn't a huge deal. I mean, you're going through the Great Depression. That's hard enough patriotism wasn't huge. During the war, it becomes huge. And kids were supposed to salute the flag. And they would salute the flag by doing this. With the palm up, not the palm down, which looks a lot like what? Like a Nazi salute. But kids were told, until somebody said, what do you think? That's nuts. You look like a bunch of Nazis, saluting the American flag while you said the pledge. But in 1942, Jehovah's Witnesses, part of what they believe, and there's a lot in Jehovah's Witnesses. They're an Adventist group. Jesus is coming back really soon. That's the big thing with Jehovah's Witnesses. Is they don't accept not only holidays, but also they won't pledge allegiance to any civic government. So they don't recognize the authority of civil government. Mm-hmm. And so they can't pledge allegiance to a flag, because that for them that would be heresy. You pledge allegiance to who? God. Do you pledge allegiance to anything other than God? No. Therefore, you cannot pledge allegiance to a flag. Now, 1942, the law says what? Every child needs to stand and do what? Pledge allegiance to the flag. Jehovah's Witness child says, I can't do that. Jehovah's Witness, not child, but father, is what? Arrested. And the Supreme Court case, and like I said, I can't remember the name. So it went all the way to the Supreme Court because he was convicted, of violating this law. And it went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said, there's a freedom of religion. And you cannot insist on, and this was before under God. This was just pledge allegiance to the flag. So it wasn't a God thing at all. But for Jehovah's Witnesses it was. That they could not pledge allegiance to the United States. They couldn't do it. It would violate their religion. And the Supreme Court said, you're right. You cannot insist on a child pledging allegiance. Yeah, I remember when I was growing up in school, during the Pledge of Allegiance, in my school, they left. In my school, we had like 3 Jehovah's Witnesses, 4 Jews. And the Jehovah's Witnesses had to leave during the Pledge of Allegiance. And they stayed in the hall because we always did the Pledge of Allegiance, and then on the speaker, the Lord's Prayer. The principal did the Lord's Prayer. And so the Jews could stay for the Pledge of Allegiance, and then they left during the Lord's Prayer. And they stood in the hall. And after it was over, the teacher said, come on in. And they'd come on in. So it was just a different time. But that's, Jehovah, that's also part. And again, it's related theologically to what they believe. Sometimes it'd be interesting because each of those little cults are linked to some old heresies that go all the way back to the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century. Way, way back. All Christian Science, Jehovah's Witness, Mormons they're out there. They're a little bit out there. Their theology is unique.
I remember when this couple converted to be a Jehovah's Witness, I watched them. Our neighbor across the road had a big barn, and I watched them tote all of their holiday decorations over and put them in the barn. Why they didn't burn them, I don't know. I never had the courage to ask them after the ordeal with the kids, and I just didn't want to cause any more ruckus.
Yeah, I think that might.
I did say to his wife, why are you putting away your Christmas decoration? What's going on? We don't believe in that. Jesus is not the Messiah.
Right.
And I just looked at her and I thought, you're wacky.
Well, what they believe goes back to what's called Arianism. And a guy named Arius, and we're talking about the 3rd century, he said, because the Trinity is complicated. How can you have 3 persons but one God? How can God be 3 persons? I mean, you're either 3 gods or you're one God, which means the other 2 can't be God. But how can you have 3, each one equally God? Well, you could say, well, you just do. And somebody says, well, explain it to me. And now we're in deep water, And that's what Jehovah's Witness, that's what Arius taught. That there's only one God. And the Son, the Word, is the first creation of God. So there's one God, and the Son, who becomes Jesus, is the first creation of God. That does not make him God. It makes him the first creation of God, as we are creations of God, only he is above us. And that's what they believe. Now Mormons, on the other hand, so you can have one God, but Jesus isn't God. Son isn't God. That's easy. The Jews would accept that. The Muslims would accept that. That's what they say about Jesus, just not God. We like him. He's just not God. Now Mormons, on the other hand, they say this Trinity is a mess. I can't believe in the Trinity. So you got 3 persons, right? Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Well, let's just call them each God. So instead of having one God, we have 3 gods. And if you're really good, you might be a God too. You can become a God too. And get your own planet. Mormons out there. God will give you your own planet to rule.
And 7
Oh yeah.
wives.
Oh yeah. What's that?
And 7 wives.
Which I cannot even conceive. Sometimes one is enough.
I'm sure my husband thinks that too.
But then one husband is enough. But sometimes we could talk about it. Like I said, all of them go back to something that's happening historically. There's a reason. I mean, Christian Scientists, they go back to Gnosticism. I mean, that's what they are. They're just Gnostics. They just developed in the 19th century. I mean, that's what happened. So, okay, we'll look at this next week. I see you got additional endings. Maybe we'll look at the additional endings too, to Mark.
Mine has both endings in it.
Yeah, fascinating. We'll talk about that. All right, let's have a word of prayer. Lord God, thank you for guiding us through this, and help us to remember that no matter what happens in our lives, we can go to Jesus in prayer. No matter how much doubt we may have, or fear, or just plain confusion, Jesus will listen. And not only will he understand, he can actually identify with us. So help us to remind us of that as we approach him in prayer. In the name of Christ we pray. Amen.
Amen.